Who is Tula? Tula was an African slave from Curaçao. Tula is mainly known as one of the leaders, along with Carpata, a nickname for Bastion or Bizian, of the Great Rebellion. Tula worked for years in slavery on the Kenepa, Nip, plantation west of Curaçao. He protested against the injustices that slaves suffered at the hands of their masters and fought for freedom and equality. He addressed his fellow slaves and took the initiative, on August 17, 1795, to join with around 40 to 50 other slaves to stop working and go to their owner, Caspar Lodewijk van Utrecht, to plead for their freedom. This was the beginning of the largest slave revolt in the history of the Dutch Antilles. Under Tula's leadership, around 2,000 slaves marched to the governor's office in Willemstad. From the surviving sources about Tula, it is clear that he was well informed, spoke multiple languages, and was skilled in rhetoric. He used arguments from Christian doctrine and politics and referred to changing laws of his time. This made him a respected leader. When armed conflict proved necessary during the confrontation with the colonial army to achieve his goal, he did not shy away from it, but his primary motivation was not power, wealth, or violence. His main goals were the freedom of the slaves and the equality of all people, which he fought for until his death. As the leader of this rebellion, Tula was one of the most important freedom fighters in the Dutch Antilles, and in 2010 he declared a national hero of Curaçao. Every year on August 17, the uprising he led is commemorated on Dia de Lucha pa Libertad, the Day of the Freedom Fight, also known as the Tula Commemoration. Discontent on the plantation. Slavery was very common at that time, and Curaçao was even an important post for slaves. Around 1795, discontent grew on the plantations due to the deteriorating living and working conditions. Slaves complained about the scarce food and the expensive groceries that they had to buy themselves. They were forced to work even on Sundays, which were normally their day of rest, in order to pay for their own food. This went against the slave regulations, in which the master was supposed to provide food for his slaves. In addition, there was dissatisfaction with the unfair and harsh punishments that were meted out. Tula protested against this state of affairs and pointed out to the masters that they were not even following their own rules. When in 1795 the Batavian Republic, present-day Netherlands, and therefore also the Dutch Antilles, came under French rule, and it was rumored that the slaves in Haiti were freed under French rule. He believed he finally had solid ground to demand the same for the slaves of Curaçao. Together with Bastion Carpeta, Louis Mercier, Pedro Wacau, and other slaves from plantations in the area who thought the same about slavery, he began to organize meetings, and within a few days, he had formed a small army that was willing to fight for their freedom. He addressed his fellow slaves and took the initiative to revolt. Rebellion and reporting about Tula during negotiations. Monument in memory of the rebellion at Kenepa Plantation House. On August 17, 1795, Tula refused to work, and together with about 40 to 50 fellow slaves, he went to his owner Caspar Lodewijk van Utrecht to plead for their freedom, which they believed they were entitled to. Due to force, Van Utrecht referred him to the governor in Willemstad to tell his story. The group under Tula's leadership left. The group traveled across the island, passing through various plantations such as Lagun, Santa Cruz, Porto Marie, San Nicolas, Santa Martha, and San Juan, with more and more slaves joining them. They freed imprisoned slaves, expanding the group led by Tula to 2,000 slaves. During the rebellion, a teacher named Mr. Sobel was tied to a horse and died. The colonial council tried to stop the rebellion and negotiate for the slaves to return to their plantations. Various envoys were sent to speak with Tula as the leader of the rebellion and reported back. These Eurocentric sources form the majority of what is known about Tula. One of the envoys was the Franciscan Father Jacobus Schenk. In his writings, he tells that even the Bible is involved in Tula's speech, and he points out the injustice that is being done to them. As a message to the governor, Tula tells Father Schenk a final message: "We desire nothing but our freedom." However, this was not given to the slaves, which led to several weeks of bloody battles with the army of the colonial council with varying success. Due to his role in the uprising, Tula received the nickname Rigaud, after the French general and leader of the slave revolt in San Domingo, André Rigaud, who led to the freedom of the slaves in Haiti. It was even claimed that Tula was in contact with him. His fellow slaves in Curaçao hoped that he would lead them to freedom, just like Rigaud did. Tula death. The description of Tula's punishment and execution. On September 18, 1795, Tula was betrayed by a fellow slave of Caspar Lodewijk van Utrecht and sentenced to death. After being forced to make a false statement that his real goal was to kill all the whites on the island. After prolonged torture, Tula confessed that he had been inspired by the French Revolution and the liberation of slaves in Haiti. He believed that slavery should be abolished in Curaçao by overthrowing white domination and taking over the government himself. Based on these false statements, Tula was sentenced to death and executed. He was tied to a cross and his bones were broken with an iron rod from underneath, tortured to death. Then his face was scorched, burned, with torches. And finally, he was beheaded. His head, along with that of Carpeta, was then placed on a pole and used as a deterrent at the gallows. The rest of his body, along with those of co-leaders Bastian Carpeta and Pedro Wacau, was weighted with stones and thrown into the sea. Tula aftermath and effect of the uprising. The fact that the uprising was brutally suppressed and Tula was executed does not mean that his initiative had no effect. His revolt is seen as an important first step in the emancipation of the black population of Curaçao. After Tula's death, the Dutch authorities ensured that the planters treated their staff better to prevent further uprisings. On November 20, 1795, new rules of the infamous slave regulation regarding the treatment of slaves were announced and strictly enforced. For example, Sunday was made a day off again. There were regulations for maximum working hours and minimum provisions of food and clothing. Tula's resistance and the resulting uprisings contributed to the Netherlands abolishing slavery 68 years later in 1863, many years after England and France. Since the 1980s, Tula has been commemorated in various ways. In 1985, a proclamation declared August 17, the day the uprising began, as Dia de Lucha pela Libertad, the day of the struggle for freedom. Every year on this day, the uprising is commemorated and the leaders, especially Tula, are honored, which is why it is also called the Tula Commemoration or Day of Tula. In the same year, the Parc de Lucha pela Libertad, Park of the Struggle for Freedom, was opened at the Reef, where a statue of Tula has stood since 1998 on the spot where he was beheaded. In 1970, a statue of Tula was already made in Curaçao by the Dutch sculptor Tulas Rebellion. However, there was a lot of protest at the time because he was still seen as a villain and some Antillians believed that slavery should be better forgotten. Hagenaars, therefore, took the statue back to the Netherlands, where it was placed in Winschoten. The new monument by Nel Simon from 1998 on the south coast of Curaçao is now one of the attractions on the island, where the Tula Commemoration takes place every year. Since 1998, there has also been the Route of Tula, a journey along the main places of Tula's struggle during the slave uprising, where history is brought back to life by actors. This is held annually around the Commemoration Day of Tula. From 2007 to 2021, the Tula Museum was located in Londwi Kenepa, NIP, where Tula worked as a slave and began the slave uprising. Here, in addition to the story of Tula, one could learn more about the Afro-Curaçaoan cultural heritage, including the history of slavery and resistance to it. In 2009, 7 new monuments were erected, indicating the trail of the resistance of 1795, 7 white pillars with a fist holding a broken chain. At Londwi Kenepa, NIP, Santa Cruz, Porto Marie, Salina or Reef Sainte Marie, Seri Neger, and Savonnet.